Hi, good evening, everybody, and welcome to our weekly Q&A session. So I'm TJ, specialist in highly gifted education with Passend Education. I'm on a mission to make gifted kids more happy, autonomous, and successful. And because we've got a lot of new parents joining us this week, I thought I would like to talk a little bit about what we do in our classes and also a little recap on what giftedness is before we dive into quite a bunch of questions that we've had today around positive discipline and so on. But in any moment you feel you want to ask a question, please type something in the chat or raise your hand, and I would love to take some, for the more braver among us, I would love for you to voice your questions out straight away. Please don't see these as these one-on-one lectures. They don't have to be. So with that, we'll talk about the very important part of our sessions, which is particularly games and giftedness. All right, so let's kick this off with a little giftedness recap. So what are highly gifted or what are gifted individuals? So the way we look at giftedness, and traditionally giftedness was identified as an IQ of 130 or more. Renowned organizations like Mensa still use this as a minimum standard in terms of how you can get admission, although they have some new regulations around how they actually look at an IQ. But in a very traditional sense, IQ was the only measure used for about 110 years. And we now know that that's a little bit too broad, because an IQ of 130 is a bit of a snap assessment in a moment of time. If you woke up groggy, brain fog, whatever, you might score lower than you're capable of. But we even know that kids from different social economic backgrounds tend to score much worse on IQ tests. And we also know that bilingual kids tend to score lower. And even though IQ tests often look at different kinds of aptitudes, and there's lots of variations of it, one that is very common is the WISC-4 that is being used, and the WISC-5 as well. And these are essentially versions of what is a relatively standard aptitude test. In some of the schools we work with, they use CAT-4. Bear in mind that CAT-4 is not a direct IQ test as such, but it does use a lot of components which are very similar. All right, so if IQ alone is not what makes a gifted individual, what does? Now, what we do know with gifted individuals is that they tend to learn things faster than most people around them. And what percentage of people that is up for debate in a lot of academic works, some going as high as 10%. We ourselves in Passend Education like to say that an individual that can learn one or more skills faster than 95% of the population is a very emotionally creative, intense person, very creative person, essentially, would be potentially considered as a gifted individual. And that is often reflected, but not limited to, an IQ of 130. Now, that also means that when you look at that definition, it doesn't mean that they're good at everything. A lot of gifted individuals are hyper-focusing on one single thing that they're very good at, and to the detriment of anything else, with high probability of perfectionism, sometimes leads them down these trains of hyper-focus on one thing, and then basically the way society is sort of set up, how we have a lot of competitions, a lot of recognition, makes this hyper focus on a single subject very common with gifted individuals. Traditionally, though, like from the time of the Renaissance, when we're talking about the Renaissance man, where people were sort of encouraged to go as broad as possible. You need to be both an artist and an engineer. Like the Da Vinci's of their time, they were sort of there was a bit of rivalry among them of who could be both the best artist and an inventor of something important. And what we actually want to see when we work with gifted kids is that we don't focus too much on this one thing that they're good at. Ideally, we want to give them the opportunity to be more well-rounded, right? And what is very interesting is when you look at like how development happens in kids, is that when we really look as far back as we can, like toddlers and so forth, that actually the scientific canon doesn't really say that kids have an aptitude for math or have an aptitude for English. What we do see is that gifted kids basically build that aptitude and that interest so much faster. And you can imagine how that works, right? So if you're 2 years old and you're starting to understand reading, writing, and you start reading more, then that gets encouraged. So like parents will go, "Oh, he's reading or she is reading. Therefore, I'm going to get them some more books that are a little bit more interesting because they've finished all the fairy tale books that we already had." And then it becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. We say, "Oh yeah, they're just really good at English." Or similar things can happen with math, right? So there's a lot of gifted individuals are self-taught. They start looking at things and start adding things up. I mean, there's numbers and there's letters all around us. So as long as you are willing to observe and look and try new things and be curious, there's a lot of opportunity to learn new things by yourself. And there might still be some element of outside factors having an impact on that, of course, but like to the people that see kids like moment to moment, like some educators will do, or some family members, they go, "Oh, he's already capable of reading," not knowing that some of these kids have actually taught themselves by just observing for a few years longer than we thought. So we've seen, my mom has written a book specifically on dealing with challenging toddlers, or challenging toddlers is the book in the Netherlands, and we can see elements of giftedness as early as 2 years old, right? So, but that means there's 2 years before they go to their kindergartens that they tend to pick up things already. Now that little bit of learning black hole, a lot of people then think, "Oh, like they can already read," but they miss the fact that they might have been practicing for 2 years, right? So that is an important part with giftedness. Now, the second thing about giftedness that is really important to know is that giftedness is a neurodivergence, right? So this has always been a bit controversial because the term gifted can be a little bit unlucky, because it basically means, oh, you are a lucky person, you have a gift, you're better automatically than others. That's a lot of assumptions because of the way that having access to things like books and having access to things like toys that are more engaging, or that work with math, or like math, for example, like the richer people are, the more access they have to these kind of early childhood toys. So what we tend to see is if we have kids that can learn faster, they have access to better equipment or better surroundings, where people have the time to spend with their kids a little bit more. There's a lot of parents of gifted kids that are from very poor backgrounds in India, you name it, and they basically don't have the luxury of spending so much time with their kids, which is also one of the important factors in how kids learn, right? So you can see how gifted education or giftedness in itself sometimes manifests more obviously and early with better to do, well-to-do families. And that has given a bit of a connotation of giftedness being a bit elitist. And one of the things that we see when we start identifying gifted kids earlier and more consistently, and we're basically screening across the board, not just with the parents that have the ability to pay for these particular tests, because like WISC 4 and 5s are not cheap. Basically, some of them in Malaysia can go up to 10,000 ringgit if you do the full aptitude test. So you can imagine that again also puts a bit of a funnel on where we find these kids. But when we test more broadly, or we find kids more broadly, we see that actually you can find them also in the poor social economic environment. So being gifted is definitely not a trait of being rich, although again, like gifted parents often have some opportunities, particularly in countries like in Asia, where we can hyper-focus quite quickly and then do extremely well. Like again, that then builds on the resources you have, and you have like a self-fulfilling prophecy going on, right? So that is giftedness in terms of a recap. Now, one of the things that I want to talk about with giftedness that is really key, that I think is not an identification tool as such, right? So one of the traits that, or actually 5 traits we tend to see with gifted individuals is what we call overexcitability. So these are the things that gifted kids tend to do that to outsiders look like a little bit extreme. And these are not exclusive to gifted kids, like kids with ADHD, ASD, dyslexia, all the other kind of plethora of special education needs have a lot of these similarities too, right? So if you see, and I'm going to name them, you're going to probably recognize them from a lot of your kids yourself. So the first one is the motor overexcitability. The psychomotor overexcitability. And what that is that the need to constantly move, right? So a lot of gifted kids cannot sit still. They're constantly hopping around. They need something to fill. They seem to be zooming around and have endless amount of energy. Right, so this particular one, of course, you can see with kids with ADHD as well. Now, we do know that it comes from a very different part of the brain, like why this is happening. But it is something that, like, when you have a kid that is identified potentially gifted, it's very common to see them have this motor overexcitability. Now, it's not like they only have one. Sometimes they have multiple. Sometimes they've learned how to mask a lot of this stuff as well. One of the challenges that we tend to see in Asia is that the identification is so late. So we tend to find kids only when they're really struggling in school, that they've learned how to deal with this. And a good example of this, I had a boy that basically the teachers didn't know that he had this massive need, because these are real needs in their brains, to move. And so what he did is he would sit in the classroom and then he would just do little squats, but basically underneath his table, so that the teacher wouldn't see that he was doing it. Right, and when we asked the teachers, like, does he move around? No, we never see it. And then we asked the boys, like, yeah, I can't sit still, but I've just learned how to do this, and then that nobody seemed to bother me when I did that. So yeah, it's that's how I deal with it. So that's motor overexcitability. Then we have sensual, right? So the sensual overexcitabilities. This is the challenge that a lot of gifted kids have when it comes to loud sounds or sensations on their skin. So a lot of gifted kids, they don't like to touch things like clay or sticky things or so on. I've had one boy I was working with that basically wanted to quit his sport because he likes the sport, but he doesn't like the fact that he's going to be sweaty afterwards. And we changed that. We helped him change that to swimming, and now he's fine, for example. But this overstimulation is also sort of a byproduct of that extensive ability to see lots of detail and remember and experience lots of fine things around us, right? So being this over-excitable towards like sensory things is a real challenge that they deal with, but it can also be a real boon if they want to, for example, play music and they can hear these perfect, intricate little sounds, right? So yeah, the sensual bit there is a big challenge for them. Then we have the imagination. So the imagination or overexcitability is basically the idea that whatever is in their head is more interesting than what's happening around them. So these are the kids that are daydreaming. Whenever they can do this sometimes in the middle of a sentence when you're having a conversation. So a simple thing that that makes them think about something else, or makes them think, "Ooh, like what would be the answer to that question?" Makes them completely lose focus. And this is some the sensual and imagination parts of the overexcitabilities we see a lot with kids on the spectrum as well, right? So so there's obviously some similarities, but again, the imagination part doesn't seem to be triggering in the same part of the brain as the ASD kids is, right? There's some distinct differences, but the behavior, for all intents and purposes, looks really the same. Now, then there's the intellect, or the intellectual overexcitability. So the intellectual overexcitability is this need to just ask questions and find out how things work and what other stuff that we can do, right? So and this is obviously what drives a lot of that early learning with a lot of these kids. and building up that learning advantage, as we call it as well, right? So this is a very common one with gifted kids. And then through brokenhearted, because this is the last one, which is the emotional overexcitability. So the emotional overexcitability is this inability often to control their emotions, or the experience that they have with emotions is much more intense. And there's some elements of us when we're doing brain scans of gifted individuals, seeing that there's just more activity between different parts of the brain, which is really important. We also know that there's this thing called the Sylvian fissure, which is in between the two halves of the brain in the prefrontal cortex, that basically we suspect has something to do with inhibiting emotional movement, which is traditionally actually kind of a good thing to have, because it means we don't act like cattle and cows and run around whenever something scary happens. But with our gifted kids, we see that this emotional experience is much more intense. So how this manifests is you see kids go from super sad to super happy very quickly, and any emotion in between. And to outsiders, this looks like really like kids overreacting to things that don't make much sense. Right? It's like, why are they so scared or so angry or so frustrated? And part of that is literally like how their brain works. Now, honestly, this is not different from other people. Like neurotypical people also need to learn how to manage their emotions, but they have a little bit of a challenge where gifted kids are really good at avoiding emotions because they can take good, logical, complex strategies and use that to not deal with the emotion. And a very good example of that is little kids sort of going, I don't like playing in the playground. It makes me feel sticky, and the kids are not nice, and then I have to ask for things, and I'm scared. I don't want to do this. So what I'm going to do is going to take a book, and I'm going to sit here and read, because I've noticed that if I go sit and read a book, the teachers in the playground don't bother me. Right. And that means that they don't run into these emotional issues, and then they'll get used to it. So we also call this asynchronous development, because when they're obviously reading a book, they start to pull ahead in terms of their general reading knowledge, or if the book is something scientific, whatever, they basically develop beyond their age peers. But their emotional state or mastery stays behind. And that asynchronous development is one of the main reasons we see a lot of gifted burnout and so on. So this emotional overexcitability seems like a very common factor, even though sometimes outwardly it doesn't really look like that's a big challenge. Now, why is this all important? Because what we want to do when we work with our kids, we basically focus on quite a lot of models, and a very nice one that I like to use is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So the very first rank, like for those that haven't heard of Maslow's hierarchy yet, most of you probably have seen it somewhere in school. The idea is that humans have particular needs that have to be met before you can jump to the next rank. And that means that, and often when we look at like what is the intended outcome for a school or for education, we look at like the last two ranks. So we have the physiological needs. So this is the need to eat and have sustenance. So this is basically the idea being that this is the most important need that you have. If you have nothing to eat or to drink, you will risk everything else to sort of fix that, generally speaking, right? This is why people steal bread, that's foregoing a lot of social status or even safety situations, right? So the first one is that. The second one is safety. So the safety needs are things like a roof above your head, and to some extent, families around you that take care of you. In the old days, like a weapon or so forth. What you tend to see when you throw people on an uninhabited island, they'll first start looking for food, then they start looking for shelter, right? So the safety needs, and we sort of assume that the parents take care of this bit. And obviously the country we're in, there's some rules and how everybody needs to act. A lot of this stuff is there. Now we also then have the next one is either the social, but they're also called the love and belonging. And the love and belonging needs and the social needs are basically, once you've got a house, you want to be part of a group. And this is what you tend to see again if you take the analogy of a desert island. Then what you have is like, if you're all alone, a lot of them don't tend to thrive. There's some exceptions to this, of course, but what we tend to see is that if this social love and belonging thing isn't functioning well, what we tend to see is that the kids are unhappy. So this is actually where happiness sits. And the question is, are our kids really happy where we are? And with gifted kids, this is often a no, because they feel like they don't belong. They're often very misunderstood. Therefore, they don't feel loved, right? And then that whole thing sort of falls apart. And whether that then manifests in them sort of going, I'm going to just get myself out of here. I'm going to do something else. I'm going to find my tribe. Leave school and so forth. Much less common here in Asia, but it happens a lot in the West, right? Because the idea of just being able to quit school seems, even to the bit more rough boys sometimes that I work with, not like something that is on the table at all, right? But then the flip side of that is that you hold somebody against their will somewhere, they start often internalizing that as anxiety and frustration. So the flip side of not seeing a lot of kids actually drop out of school at the age of 14 and 16 is that they sort of mentally do check out, and they become extremely sad. And it's one of the reasons why unfortunately, I believe suicide rates in Malaysia are a little bit higher than we would like them to be. So yeah, this is an important thing, the happiness. Unfortunately, we find that a lot of programs and schools don't really focus on this at all, and we see a lot of articles about like how COVID has made all of this worse. So you could argue that this is something that actually would be good for not just non-gifted kids. It would be for many gifted kids as well. But when it comes to gifted kids, is that for them it's such an existential need that we have to work a little bit faster on it. So so we can't even talk. I'm not going to talk about the last two. Simply because I think like it's important that we stay with this. And as we go through the curriculum over the next couple of weeks or so, we're going to take these last two rungs up here. So we're going to revisit this at some point, right? So this is Maslow's hierarchy. So how do we approach this? Like, what do we do in our classes? And what should a gifted and talented program really have to help these kids, right? So what we do is the very first thing that we do is we use these specific kind of games. Now, games are amazing tools. Gamification, there's a whole idea around like how can we gamify different problems, how we can gamify learning. There's lots of apps that tend to do this kind of stuff where we say, oh, how do we get the attention? How do we get that learning going? And one of the things with games is that like they tend to go much deeper, and what you see with kids is when they grab a game, they tend to pick it up so fast. They hold that information, they really work with it, and that's a lot of educators get really jealous with that, because they go, oof, man, I wish I could do the same with my subject. And then we get people that come up with lots of games, and then the difference though is like when we talk about a game, those are games behind me. There's lots of board games out here, and I can guarantee you the level of math and English in these games is very, very, very high, very high. However, when you look at some people that say I've made a math game, and they'll have like these flashcards with like 2 times 3 is 6, and blah, all that kind of stuff, and you give that to the kids, honestly, most of them don't care. So it's not the same thing. So that's games. I'm going to go a little bit more into detail this week about what we do with games, but I'll quickly show the other 4 pillars before we move on. So we have the effective time for the second pillar. So effective time, also known as social emotional development, are things like play therapy, neurolinguistic programming around like social behaviors and so on. There's lots of materials out there that you can use to basically work with the kids in this, but it's obviously there to help with the emotional regulation, right? So that's the affective time that we work with. Then we have play, right? And play is so important because it is allowing the kids, particularly gifted kids that often put themselves a little bit really outside of the normal social structure, to find out what they can do. And obviously, play isn't quite the same as games. Games have rules, right? So a board game has specific rules that we all agree on, and they're basically, generally speaking, you can't change them. If I change the rule of a game, I'll be called a cheater. So that actually makes social interactions a little bit harder. And sports, for that matter, I classify as a game too. Like, so when you play football, you have rules. What we're looking for is unstructured, semi-unsupervised play. And the idea being is that when you play with somebody else, what you actually do is you sort of on the fly make up rules that can be changed as the interaction with the group changes. These are really magical to watch. There's many books on play. The number of hours of play in education in the Netherlands is extremely high compared to countries around it. Like Finland does the same as well. It is really important. So we bring it in some form also into our curriculum. It does change a little bit if we're dealing with primary kids or whether we're dealing with secondary kids, of course, because it's hard to get 16-year-olds to play hide and seek. Not impossible, by the way. We got, I think, a group of 50 kids playing a very intricate game of tag at one of our camps, and they absolutely loved it. So you'd be surprised how much fun it is. And then when we got the parents involved, you'd be surprised how fanatical they were. So there's lots of opportunities for that. And then the last bit is basically project-based learning. And project problem-based learning is, to me, one of those gold standards of how you can interact with people. It's the idea that you present a problem within a set amount of parameters and you give some creative constraint, and then you let kids solve it. We're going to go a lot into this eventually. So these are the 4 pillars that we build our entire curriculum on. Every lesson, we go through these 4. Right, so today, we're going to focus on games. Like, what does that look like? And maybe some of you have seen some of these games already before. Like when we've been doing the open sessions at some of the schools, if you had a child that we assessed, we talked about these games particularly. These are the kind of games that we work with. Now, there's few companies that make games like this. The one that we work with, and in the Netherlands, we've worked with them for a very long time, is Smart Games. They're a company from Belgium, started off really small. They now are almost every country in the world, and these games are a bit like puzzles, right? I do believe I have a copy of it, one here. A little bit older version, but it's the same idea. So if you haven't seen these white boxes like this, it might sometimes look a little bit like that. The idea with these games is that they have a bit of they're single player games, so almost like puzzles. Best way to describe them, right? So a lot of gifted kids love puzzles, by the way, but yeah, like the thing with puzzles is they serve kind of a different purpose. For us, when we work with these games, there's 3 distinct things that we want to do with them. Right. So the first one you've seen is assessments, right? So in assessments, we use games like this. And we had a parent ask us, like, how come you guys can in just an hour get to the core of what my child seems to be? And the big thing with that is that we want to observe them learning something, but a lot of the kids tend to mask what they do in education. So if you give them a worksheet or a book or anything else, what happens is they will act in a certain way because they've learned how to mask, or they are already scared of it. They think it's a test. Like the number of kids that come to us in our assessments and go, it's a test, I'm being judged. And then we say, no, we're just going to play some games. And then you can see this big weight just. Okay. But what is really cool though is like when you then give a box like this to a bunch of kids, so here you go, have fun. And the way that they choose the number of games, because we give them like 50 games to choose from, tells us a lot about them. Some of them can't make choices already. They think it's too much. They say, oh no, there's too many things. Or I'm too worried that I'm going to choose a game I can't do. And the questions they ask, they say so much. It's like, oh, which one is hard? Like which one do you think I can do? And when we do assessments, we basically do not tell them. Very important step, right? So that's one of the things that we do with them. And then we give them, they choose a game. We ask them why, figure out why. And then what they do is some of them, they start playing. And they don't even look at the booklets that come with it. They just start taking the components and they just start coming up with something. That we can see is somebody, an autodidact, so somebody who likes to teach themselves by trial and error. This is a person that is going to take the book and inspect every piece beforehand. So and to what extent they do that, that tells us a lot about, again, like, are they perfectionistic or not? Then they have to, when they find the actual rules, and what is really nice about these games, the rules are often just a single page, but they're quite extensive, like really complex game rules, right? So you need to read them well, and if you don't, you might actually get stuck. So we can see the ones that are just skimming things, or they're not reading things well, and then they get stuck a little bit later, and that tells us a lot on like how they would potentially can get stuck in their homework and so on, right? So this, the games in this situation are amazing. They're actually a lot of fun, and they start very easy and then they get exponentially hard. Even when we give parents to do this, and if you're going to join us in some of our evening sessions, we will always start with a bunch of these games. I can guarantee you, you'll be hooked on them. They're extremely fun, and they actually teach you a lot. So the first one is assessments, really important part, and we even teach teachers how to use them in the class. The second one is how to build grit. Right, so some of you might have run into educators or online influencers have been saying that the most important thing you can teach your kids is grit. Now, what is grit? Is the ability to continue or start and sustain a task till its completion. Right, even if you don't really want to. Now, there's lots more depth to what grit is, and you can, there's different. Not everybody is equally as committed to one thing or another. Some need big goals, some want self-improvement kind of thing. But the idea is that, like, a lot of gifted kids, because they're so overly stimulated by things around them, or they have learned to cope with boring stuff because they've been advanced for a while, they build up what we call avoidance behaviors. And avoidance behaviors can take forms of perfectionism, right? So focus on something I know I can do, so that I can tell people, look, I'm not procrastinating. I haven't finished this thing yet, right? Which is not the same, but it's a form of procrastination, right? So there's other forms where they just start walking around. So this is where the 5 overexcitabilities come back in. And what we tend to see is that the type of procrastination that the kids display when it comes to certain work is very linked to what kind of hypersensitivity they have, right? So if things are boring, they will start daydreaming, for example. Now, why is it important with these particular kind of games? When we give these, the first few levels are like tutorial levels. They're super easy, but it's still kind of fun because you're doing something new. These things have really nice feel to them. They make very pleasant sounds. It's like, okay, I'm doing something new. But after like 2 or 3 levels, they'll go, here we go again. I know this now. And then what starts to happen is they start skipping levels. And this is where these games are so beautiful, because they are exponentially getting more and more difficult. Some of the games that we work with have over a quadrillion options, right? So there's a game called Quadrillion, and when you actually do the math to see how many different variations of the game, you can have 4 point something quadrillion options in it, which is crazy. And you can understand then that if you're going to do something that has that many options, you need a strategy. You cannot just try it. It will take too long. We calculated it was like over 5,000 years or something crazy, like just to try all the different variations. If you do one every second and you don't have to eat and sleep and all that kind of stuff. So you have to do something else. But what we do with the kids is we tell them, it's okay, you are not allowed to skip. And we explain to them why. Because when they do these last levels, they often get stuck. So we let them get stuck. And then when we ask them, why did you get stuck? We say, well, okay, we help them reflect. They figure out, oh, yeah, it's because maybe I shouldn't have skipped. And then they'll go back halfway. And then we say, no, actually, there's something better that you can do. How do you make something that is boring more interesting? And there's ways that you can do that, right? So a good example is like, if I were to ask you as parents to run across the field and just say, okay, you know what, there's a football field here, just walk across. Now, that is not very interesting, kind of annoying, actually. Then the question becomes, like, how do I make that interesting? If I say, well, what if you try to run as fast as you can, right? Okay, well, that would be interesting. I will do that. Maybe that's like a little game that you can play. I'll try to beat like 5 minutes. Okay. But what if I asked you to try to beat your personal best? Right? So really like your personal best. How would you do that? So I have to start thinking about what kind of shoes do I wear? Should I eat something already before? Should I stretch? Should I warm up? How do I time it? And how do I know I'm progressing? Now there's a lot of things that all of a sudden make that same assignment much more interesting. And you can do the same when we work with these games. So what we tell the kids is like, okay, the aim of this game is for you to learn how to set a goal for the number of levels that you want to do, and then work towards a strategy to do that faster and faster. And that's every lesson they come in, we ask them, set a goal. You guys get 20 minutes to do it. Like how many levels are you going to do? They write it down, and then afterwards they check that they get there. And if they get it way too easily, we'll coach them and say, okay, set a higher goal. Make sure that you're not bored again. And what is really magical is they go from sometimes kids that can't sit still, can't focus, or start daydreaming, to kids that start like really speeding it up. So that is the grit part of these games. The last bit is flow. Now, this is not as clear for the young kids yet, but it's really, really important for our teens, right? So flow, for those that don't know this, is when you take a task that has a difficulty versus effort, right? So like tasks that you do are either too hard or too easy, right? So that is normally not nice. You want something that is not too difficult so that you can't do it, and not too easy so that it becomes boring, right? So you want a task that is kind of exactly in the middle. And if a task sort of keeps more going up in difficulty and it needs the right kind of effort, you get this line going up, which is the ideal task. Now, realistically, this is not a line. This is more like a corridor where stuff sits in. And then if I start working on something, the process of doing a task, learning how to do it, makes things easier. So as you're doing a task, it slowly becomes less difficult to do, right? And at that point, it sort of go outside of this band. So what we have is we have boards, and we have like too hard. And if it's too hard, what happens is we become anxious. Funny enough, our brain thinks it's the same thing, right? So when our brain triggers boredom or anxiety for something that we can't complete, it's because the brain thinks, I'm not going to get any dopamine for this. What's the point? So the trick is, when we're educating, is we normally want to try and give them a task that is a little bit hard, and then not too hard, but right about there. And then as they progress through it, when things get too easy, we introduce a new concept. And then we keep going up and down, like a little bit of a seesaw. And if you get really good at learning, you can do this by yourself, right? So that's the thing that we're trying to teach these kids. It's like when you're inside this band of basically inside this corridor, we are in a state of flow. And what is really cool about this is, like, when you're in flow, it feels like the world sort of contracts. Everything, all the information around you sort of fades away, becomes like very pleasurable moment to work. And you can do some really hard, difficult work for a really long extended period of time, much faster than you normally would be able to. So when you're working in a flow state, you get stuff done. And I'm sure a lot of you have sort of gone into that. I hope at least that you guys have gone into a flow state before, because when you're in a flow state, I always tell my kids, it's like you're you're 2xing the amount of work output that you get out of something, and you can sustain it sometimes for an hour or 2 hours in a row. Now, kids with ADHD, when they get into a flow state, can keep going forever almost. But our gifted kids sometimes can work on a project for like 3-4 hours at the same time. Now, we have to be mindful though, when they're hyper focusing, it's not the same thing. So hyper focus is when you're so scared to fail at something that you're going to keep doing it until it's done. So this is that last minute panic before they get studying. They still sustain a lot of time, but they're doing it in an anxious state, which means if you're anxious, you're too stressed. We know cognitive ability declines when that happens. And therefore, even though they work for a long time, they don't actually get as much out of it. The idea is we want them in this particular band, inside flow. And the games do this. And when we work with the teens and we start off with the grid bit and like setting a goal and so forth, we let them go 20 minutes. As the teens start working with our games, one of the things that we start doing, we start saying to them, all right, you now know how to set goals, great, but how can you get into this flow state? So we explain to them how flow works, what it means, like both from a neurological perspective, but also from a habitual perspective. What can we do? And then first we see at what stage the kids start walking into our class and start grabbing the games by themselves. And it's kind of magical because initially we have to tell them, grab your games, time for the game. And a lot of them are like excited to see their friends. So there's a lot of talk that needs to happen. But with the teens, what we tend to see is they at some point they come in and they start, grabbing the game. They don't say anything anymore. They just sit down and they go. And then what I do is we observe them and we actually set like a little secret timer. So just to see how long it takes for all of them get into a flow state. And you can see when it happens because their breathing sort of slows down. There's just like this calmness. It's like if you've ever been in the classroom, there's almost never like complete silence, but this is almost like they're all meditating. And then you do hear the ticking of these games. But again, they have quite of a nice kind of sound to them. So like the whole classroom becomes nice. And then we start focusing on that and we say, okay, how long did it take? And then the aim is to try and help kids to get into flow as fast as possible. So when we normally start with teens, it takes them about 20 minutes. So the last 10 minutes of the first half hour that we work with them is in a flow state. When they get better and better and better at practicing this, they can basically grab a game and be in a flow state like in 2-3 minutes. Now, when that happens, they can do like half a game in one session almost. And the final bit here is when you take all of these things, grit and flow, and then you transpose it on how you deal with getting ready for exams and so forth. And then basically the actions that they need to take, getting the game ready, setting a goal, like sitting straight is a very important part too. All of a sudden it clicks for when they have to do their homework. And we see at that point that the ability to then get into flow state for exam prep is really important. And that's kind of great because normally when we talk about exam prep, we tend to find that most kids can find like an hour or 2 hour blocks sometime in the day where they can work on something. Some kids are a bit more unlucky. They only have like half an hour. So if it takes you about 20 minutes unpracticed to get into flow state, half hour of study time is kind of pointless because you're sort of not feeling it yet, and then the last 10 minutes you finally feel like you're in flow, and then you have to do something else. But if you can actually get into a flow state within 5 minutes, you have like 25 minutes left in a half an hour, and you can actually get something meaningful done. Right? Maybe you guys know the Pomodoro technique, which is always talking about like 20 minutes and then 5-minute break. Now, that if you can get into flow state in the first couple of minutes, in the 20 minutes of that Pomodoro technique, it is really powerful. And then you can reset with your 1 minute, 2-minute break that you take to the next one. Or if you're get really strong in getting into flow, you don't need to take a Pomodoro break. You can just power through it and only have like a big break every hour or so. All right. So this is where we use our games and why it's such an important part of the actual curriculum. Now there's a secret fourth one, right, which is basically habits, right? So because it's such a clear this is a start of what we need to do. The kids get a lot of regularity out of it. They get some habit out of it, and it's almost like a little bit of like mindfulness, right? So the mindfulness there is like when we have someone coming over one-on-one, and I can see that they're in a bit of a I'm not feeling well, and particularly if they've been working with us for quite a bit, just like, do you want to grab a game before we want to get started? And majority of them will, yeah, that'd be nice, right? So even in my one-on-one sessions with the kids, I like to use these kind of games, and they're, as I said, amazing tools. If you run into them and you understand a little bit like now how to use them, you're more than welcome to get some at home and then try them out. We actually can sell some to you guys if you want to. Just have to let me know. So that is the gaming part. And before I move on to some of the other questions, any questions from you, the parents right now, about this? Like, please type it in the chat or raise your hand. And if not, I'm going to move on to the next bit in this. There we go. Don't see any questions yet, so we'll just move on to some of the questions that we've had prior to this. So I've had 4 questions that I want to quickly run through with you guys before the end of the night. 3 of which are very similar in the kind of challenge, just kind of a different form of the same underlying problem. So I'll call them out. The first one is here. Is okay? So the first one is about learning how to tie shoelaces. So doing something that is actually kind of a little bit difficult, but actually putting it off to the point where parents are kind of concerned that tying the shoelaces isn't happening at a developmental stage where it should have happened already. So in this case, the girl is 8 years old, still doesn't really want to tie her shoelaces or can't, and is giving up, not trying to do it. In a very similar fashion, although again it's slightly different, is that the question is, my son has not been drinking water at school, even though we have been reminding them every morning, and how can we make sure that he'll drink his water? So this is also about a particular behavior as a parent that you would like to see that isn't happening. And in a similar sense, my son doesn't know why he needs to be responsible with his belongings. His stuff keeps disappearing, water bottle, the whole bag, books, all that kind of stuff. So I think those 3 sort of fit into the same thing. Parents want a certain behavior, and the kid is not directly showing it. So what can we do here? What does that look like? Let me just make a little bit of space so that I can potentially write some more things down. So, all right. Let's start with the behavior itself. I don't know enough about these kids to make any definitive answers, so I'm going to have to make some assumptions on why some of the stuff is happening, so that we can look at like the things we can do to help, right? So let's start with the shoelaces and the forgetting things. Shoelaces are tricky, right? Because you have to learn how to tie a bow, which is kind of hard for some of our younger kids. And what we tend to see with particularly kids that have overexcitabilities in the sensual, so they don't like to touch things, they don't like to do things. And I know this particular girl involved with this question has that problem. Basically means that like it's more easy to go towards the more cerebral stuff. So the focus on the daydreaming or cerebral thoughts, right, and the intellectual stuff. And that actually also creates a type of asynchronous development where we see a lot of gifted kids struggle with their motor skills, their fine motor skills. Very good example of that is like a boy who was asked in kindergarten to color a bunch of balloons as part of a math question, right? So like the idea was there's like 5 balloons, like the boy loses 2 and they fly away. How many balloons are left? Color the number of balloons. And the idea with these kind of subjects is to do something where you both learn math and you work on your fine motor skills because you color the balloon. Now, what this boy did, he would just put X's in there and go like, okay, it's a math problem. Here's like 3 red X's and that's it. and refused to color because coloring was boring, right? So we have a lot of these gifted kids that have a little bit of a backlog of having to learn this kind of fine motor skills, which means that if you have a child that is 8 years old, which we see kids tie their shoelaces like between 5 and 7 years old, it's like, okay, like for a gifted kid, that is still not that late. So I think the very first thing there to realize is that, okay, maybe the expectations of what time frame the kid's supposed to do this aren't always the same. And you have to keep in mind that because I know this girl is academically very advanced, right? It makes you go, oh yeah, but then tying shoelaces should be easy, and that's just not the case. So, like, just look at it this way: a bit of a yin yang. You've had to spend a lot less time having to teach this girl particular how to read and write, and unfortunately, you're just going to have to spend a little bit more time helping her learn how to tie the laces. Now, the other thing that you can do is that there is different kinds of bow ties that you could potentially use to make it easier to tie, right? So there's not only one way to do this, and one of the things is like the statement here is that the girl saying, "You guys are making fun of me." What that actually means is that she's saying like, "You're judging me. I think you're judging me." And technically you probably are, because if you've been comparing the age, there's a judgment there, and you could be actually quite happy that she sort of picks up on that, right? Which is a good thing, but it does mean that what she's really saying is like, I don't trust this anymore. I don't feel like I have a choice. So what you can do is you can actually introduce a choice by spending some time with her and finding out what kind of bow ties and other ways of tying shoes there are, right? Because if the aim is for her to become self-sufficient in that, her figuring out like what is the best way to have shoes on her feet, honestly, maybe it doesn't require laces. Like there's thousands of other things that you can do that don't require laces. But there's also different ways to lace shoes that don't even tie them in the same kind of way. And that exploring that together might be quite interesting, because there might be some shoes that she really likes as a result. So let her like take this as an opportunity to learn some knots, for example. So that is the way I would approach this, and then let go of the idea that it has to happen at the same time other things happen. When it comes to the drinking water, it's actually kind of the same problem, right? So we see, again, a behavior we want. We know they have to drink enough. Now, I don't know whether the boy in question here doesn't drink at all during the whole day, or very minimal, or only doesn't drink during school time, right? So that is a bit of a thing to ask. Like I see the same with some of my own boys and other children in class, where like when they are engaged with stuff in school, they're so excited they just forget to drink, right? So and that overexcitability, as I said, is a part of their neurodivergence. So that is something that they're going to have to learn to deal with, which kind of sometimes means that they have to run into some of the consequences of that. Now, they will drink at some point. If he wouldn't have drunk now, he would have not been with us anymore. So I'm sure that there's some stuff happening there. So again, maybe adjusting the expectation. The real question is for the age of the boy, because I don't know what the age of the boy is in this as well. You might want to figure out, okay, well, what is the actual amount? Because I see some of the kids walk around with like 2-liter water bottles, and that's technically the amount that we as adults need to drink, and little kids don't need to drink as much. What we do want is we want them to actually have a bit more of a habit in between moments of excitement where they take a little sip of water. And that is a habitual thing. So how much of that are you modeling yourself? And I'll be the first one to be very honest with that. Like, I don't have a water bottle with me all the time, which means I drink when I'm thirsty, and I go out and have that agency to sort of get my water myself from the tap or so forth. But as an adult, I think a lot of you guys might not have your water bottles with you all the time. If you actually go to work, you might, like, depending on what kind of work you have, then you might even have the opportunity to do that sometimes. So how can you model that? What does that look like? What can you do to show that behavior? Take a little break in between things that you're doing. And what you can do is, like, if you have a certain kind of rhythm in your household where it goes, okay, we have certain tasks, there's little homework that we need to do, there's some art projects, or there's things like that. Like, do you drink, model drinking in between them, right? And then can you at the same time do it like very non-confrontational, right? So as long as the water bottle is there and you have one as well, it's like, okay, come, it's time for a quick sip. And if you get used to just drinking one sip, again, don't make them try and drink like 5, 6, because it's a lot, particularly with young kids. It's like a simple sip. Come, like, and you can have a little game around it depending on how old they are. It's like, cheers. Like, let's have a little cheers around this. So fix this problem of not drinking at home first, because you have a lot less control over what's happening in school. And there's a good chance that the overexcitabilities that he's running into in school are causing it to make it harder for him to drink in the first place. But once the habit of just, like, after each thing drinking starts to set, it is a very good chance that, like, he'll be more receptive to trying doing that as well. We say, oh, you know what? Can you drink something in the breaks? You know, because there is breaks in the classrooms as well, small breaks and big breaks, and there are enough opportunities to drink in those situations as well. So this is, again, a bit of a combination of asking yourself, okay, am I asking them to drink a little bit more to a standard that I would? Is that really necessary? Are they not drinking anywhere, or are they just if we're getting to drink in the morning? And are you modeling drinking enough yourself? And when they get older, you can have some more agreements with that. Another big thing that a lot of parents sometimes forget is, like, if you want them to drink more water, you actually have to stop giving them any kind of the sweet drinks at all, because those will make it very hard for them to enjoy drinking normal water. Right, and don't forget that there's sometimes also water in other places. So we know that, like, certain drinks that do have water in them actually detract from our actual hydration, but to our mind and our, like, we feel content. So then it becomes harder to drink when you're not thirsty. And to be honest, you know, if you're not thirsty, like, you've just and somebody asks you to drink like 3 liters of water, it doesn't feel pleasant as well. Whereas when you're thirsty, sometimes you can drink 3 liters in one shot, right? So a lot of this stuff is about, like, okay, what other things do they have around them? And I can't answer that question from that format. So those are the things that I would look at, like modeling yourself. Are they being asked to drink more than they should, or are there some alternatives that they're drinking that make it harder for them to just drink the water that they should? Okay, and then in a similar, like, fashion, where it's around the behavior about forgetting things, this one is actually kind of a big one. We've dealt with that in other questions before. Basically, forgetting stuff happens again through the overexcitabilities. They're just not busy with it. However, one of the biggest mistakes I see parents make is that they don't let the kids run into the consequences of that. Now, what those consequences could be isn't about punishment, right? So if they forget stuff, don't fix the problem. Let the problem become a thing so that they can choose to say, I need help. Because if, let's say, they forget a book and then you go to the school to pick it up, then technically it's not a problem for them, right? So it's been solved. And with a lot of these things, like forgetting stuff, that's been solved. So the idea with drinking as well is that, like, sometimes in this, it's better to let them run into the problems of the small stuff so that they go, okay, I need to build a routine. And then you can sit down with them and go, okay, what do we need to do? Now, one example of this, I had a boy who was kind of a little bit addicted to his phone. but would also forget it all the time. And his mom would always come up and pick it up. And I had the same actual conversation with her where she said, like, oh, I can't deal with this all the time. I said, well, then don't. Like, he wants this stuff, or particularly when we're talking about kids in primary, if they miss one lesson and they get a little bit into trouble for it, they don't like it. So the younger they are, the more that they get frustrated. Because if they're still asking, "Oh, can we go get the book, Mom?" It's like, sorry, no, we can't. So what we did with this boy, like I told Mom, so actually what you should do is you should just, tell him, too bad. It's like, if you forget the phone, we won't get it until next time we go to Passend. And this situation was, he forgot it before a good 2.5 Christmas break, right? Where basically holiday was coming and all that stuff. And he forgot his phone, and I looked at it, and I purposely didn't send a message to the mom. And she sent me a message that, I need to go pick up this phone. And I said, well, unfortunately, we've already left. But if you want to, I can arrange for a Grab to come pick it up and all that stuff. So that's your choice. I can arrange for a Grab to go pick it up, or you can just let him run into the problem of him forgetting his phone again. And then I got a smiley face back, and I can guarantee you that this is what happened. And he came back, he took his phone, he's not forgotten his phone a single time since. Right, so this is the same thing that you can do with that. And then if they do actually need help with a routine, then you need to help them. Right, so when they say, okay, but I can't do it, like if they go like, man, I keep forgetting my water bottle, it's so frustrating, know what to do. You can actually have a sit down with them and say, okay, can we do a little ritual? If they're young, you can have a little song, or you can have like a little pat down. Like, honestly, my staff always laugh at me for this. I have a very specific ritual that I need to do to make sure that I don't forget my key, my phone, and my wallet. And if I don't take them into consideration, if I don't do them in the right order, I will forget something. And for me, even if I've told some of my staff, if you interrupt that ritual and then I forget a key or whatever, it's on you, not on me, right? Because I need to go through that ritual. And I've had it once where I went, okay, I've got my key here, I've got my phone here, and I'm putting it in, and then somebody asked me a question halfway through, and then we're outside closing the gate, and it's like, my key is still inside, and they're all like laughing a bit about it. But I had to teach myself to have that particular ritual, and you can teach your kid how to do that too. Now, ideally, you want them to get to a point where they go, I need a ritual, so I want to think about it, so that it doesn't feel like it's you pushing it on them. Now, with that, I think we've run a little bit out of time for today. So let me see. I see a quick question here. Let's see if I can still catch that one. Last one here. Okay, so in relation to forgetfulness, how about if they constantly forget their homework? Yeah, so if they constantly forget their homework, again, this is why it's so important you start as early on as possible, because in the beginning, that sort of stuff is still not as important, and they will run into some consequences when they still care about it. And then, can I ask, like, how old is the boy in this particular situation?
11.
11. Yeah, so it's starting to get to a point where the homework gets even more important in a sense, right? When it gets to that stage, I normally would like to delve a little bit deeper, whether it's happening as a consequence of just forgetfulness, or because they're trying to avoid doing it, because there's sometimes at that stage they can already start running a bit behind and the work gets a little bit harder. But again, the best way to deal with this is actually have a conversation with the teacher about what kind of natural consequences the teacher is willing to put forward for them forgetting their homework. And we have to then find something that he himself also cares enough about. Right? So there might be a situation there, but it's like, okay, we're going to, instead of going to get the homework and everything else, let him run into the problem of not having the homework ready, and then having that one hit on that grade now. Because if this becomes a habit that you cannot help him cope with, it will just escalate into worse and worse and worse. Now, the flip side of that, though, is that if he doesn't forget his homework, we also have to positively reinforce that behavior. So at that point, if he doesn't forget his homework all the time, um, you have to pick the times when he doesn't forget it and then positively reinforce that. And it doesn't mean give a reward like candy or everything and say, hey, I saw that you didn't forget your homework. Very nice, thank you. And that fact is like a little reward in itself for them, and then it will be likely that they will keep doing that more and more. That will become less and less effective the older they get. And that point we'll have to do some other things. But at age 11, there should still be a level of trust that can work with. If that isn't the case, then we probably need to put that in the next session, talk a bit about how do we build trust with a teen or a preteen, because that's a pretty long one. So I hope there's enough trust there that at least he's still willing to share the struggles of forgetting stuff. And then again, it's a little bit of okay, do you want somebody who always needs help remembering things, or do you want him to be able to make those choices for himself? And that sometimes means having a bit of an opportunity for him to fail in a safe environment. And this is why you need to talk to the teacher first, because if you just one of the reasons a lot of parents don't want this to happen is they don't want it to reflect badly on them as a parent. But if you actually sit down with the teacher and say, hey, I know he's forgetting stuff. It's way too much energy, and I don't always know when he needs things. This behavior needs to stop. So what kind of natural consequences could he have in class by forgetting one or two things that he would care enough about, to the point that he's willing to say, okay, I need help with remembering things? And then you can have an agreement with the teachers where it's in the WhatsApp groups, it lets you know what stuff they need. And it doesn't mean that you have to then ask him, do you have it? But then he needs to be able to have access to that information on time for when he's packing his bag. And then you might want to consider packing his bag not on the morning or the night before, when he has the ability to still think. Whereas in the morning, lots of things are happening, there's lots of reasons why we can forget. I hope that answers your questions.
All right. Yep. Thanks.
Okay, give it a shot. If it doesn't work, go elaborate a little bit more the next time. I would love to talk a little bit more on it.
Okay,
With that, we were shot about 10 minutes over, which is great. I thank all of you for all your time tonight. If you want to see more questions like this, see us next week, Tuesday, at 7:30, or the week after that on Thursday again, as per normal. This particular video will be online on YouTube for all of you to watch. Looking forward to seeing all of you parents in the flesh very, very soon, and looking forward to even more questions. And I wish you all a very good night.
Wow.